How many times have you rehearsed the version where it doesn't work out? You see the bill before it arrives. You imagine the number in your bank account before you even open the app. You think about the expense you weren't expecting, the payment that hasn't arrived yet, the opportunity that might disappear. And sometimes you don't just think about it once, you replay it. You run the same scene through your mind again and again until the fear feels familiar, almost automatic. You've rehearsed the conversation. You've rehearsed the disappointment. You've rehearsed not having enough. But what if you're not predicting the future? What if you're rehearsing it? Because the thoughts you repeatedly return to can become the patterns you automatically live from. And if you've spent years rehearsing lack, there is a very different habit you need to learn. A forgotten habit that can change the way you think, respond, and ultimately experience your financial life. Rehearsal is not something that only happens with intention. Most of the time it happens by accident. You don't decide to rehearse a scene, you simply return to it, and returning is enough. Here's what your mind does with anything you return to often. It stops treating it as one thought among many, and starts treating it as familiar ground. Familiar ground doesn't require permission to be visited again. It becomes the place your thoughts go when you're not steering them, the default setting your attention falls back to in an unguarded moment. This is why you don't have to believe something on purpose for your mind to become used to it. You can know intellectually that you are provided for. You can even believe in a quiet way that things will work out. And still, the moment your guard drops, your mind walks straight back to the rehearsed scene. Not because it's true, because it's practiced. Picture it in something as small as your phone lighting up. Before you've even read the notification, something in you has already braced. Maybe this happens to you more often than you'd admit. You wake up already thinking about what needs to be paid. You see a message and immediately wonder what it means. You open your banking app and your eyes go straight to the number, already preparing for disappointment. You think about the expense you weren't expecting, the payment that hasn't arrived yet, the opportunity that might disappear, and before anything has actually happened, you've already lived through the scene. By the time you look at the facts, your body has already responded to a story your mind told first. Here it's worth pausing on something important, because it would be easy to hear all of this and conclude that thinking about money at all is the problem. It isn't. There is a real difference between planning and rehearsing, even though from the inside they can feel like the same activity. Planning asks a question and looks for an answer. What do I need to set aside? What can I afford? What comes next? Rehearsing doesn't ask a question. It replays an outcome, usually the same one, until the outcome starts to feel like something that has already happened, or is certainly about to. One moves you forward, the other just runs the tape again. Think about how an actor learns a part. They don't memorize a script by reading it once with feeling. They repeat the same lines, the same movements, the same pauses, until the performance no longer requires thought. The body learns what the mind used to have to decide. This is one of the ways repetition works on us, quietly, without asking permission, without checking whether what you're repeating is something you actually want. It only registers how many times you've asked it to perform this particular scene. So when you imagine the same shortfall, the same disappointing month, the same conversation about money going wrong, you are not simply thinking about your finances, you are rehearsing them. Each repetition lowers the resistance a little, the way a path grows easier to walk with every crossing. What once required real fear to imagine now arrives on its own, uninvited, the moment a notification appears or an envelope lands on the counter. The feeling gets there before the thought does. That is not intuition. That is a scene, rehearsed so many times it no longer announces itself as one. This is where the mistake usually gets made. Most people assume that if their financial life doesn't feel abundant, thinking differently for a few days will fix it. But a scene rehearsed for years does not release its grip after one differently worded thought, any more than an actor forgets a role after skipping a single rehearsal. Patterns are built the same way they are broken, through repetition, one performance at a time, not through a single decision made once and never returned to. None of this is about blaming yourself for the scenes you've already rehearsed. You didn't wake up one day and choose fear as a script. It arrived quietly, through worry that felt reasonable, through caution that felt responsible, through 100 small moments where imagining the worst seemed like preparing for it. But preparation and rehearsal are not the same act, even though they can feel identical from the inside. One protects you, the other trains you. Most people have never been taught to tell the difference. The question worth asking then is not whether you've been rehearsing. You have. Everyone has. The real question is what exactly you've been rehearsing without noticing, and whether you're willing, starting now, to learn a different scene. Because this idea is much older than modern psychology, and Florence Scovel Shinn understood something about it that most people overlook. What you rehearse without noticing becomes the performance you give without choosing. Centuries before anyone studied habits or repetition, a single verse pointed to the same idea in older language. Paul told his readers not to be conformed to the world around them, but to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. He didn't start with circumstances. He started with the mind. Florence Scovel Shinn built much of her work on this same starting point. In Your Word is Your Wand, published in 1928, she wrote about the quiet power of the spoken word, how what a person calls forth in speech tends to become the pattern that follows them. Not because words are magic in themselves, but because a word spoken with feeling functions closer to a decree, a direction given repeatedly to the subconscious mind. She called this listening part of you the seat of habit and belief, not a scientific claim, simply the part of you that carries out instructions rather than debating them. It doesn't weigh whether a word was an affirmation spoken in faith or a fear rehearsed in dread. It carries out whichever one arrives with the most conviction, repeated the most often. This is why she placed so much weight on watching your words, not only your intentions. Intentions stay private. Words, spoken aloud or repeated silently, become instructions. This changes what rehearsing lack actually is. It isn't only an uncomfortable habit of imagination. In Florence's terms, it functions closer to a decree issued without meaning to, repeated so many times that fear, rather than faith, becomes the thing your mind expects to fulfill. Think of how easily this happens in ordinary conversation, long before any real crisis. I could never afford that. Money just disappears in this house. We're always tight this time of year. Said once in a difficult month, these are simply descriptions. Said as a reflex at the checkout counter, in a call with a friend, at the dinner table, they stop describing a month and start decreeing a pattern, a small, familiar sentence, repeated until the mind treats it as settled fact rather than a passing complaint. Which is why the real question isn't only what you want. It's what you've been decreeing without noticing, through the words you reach for first when money comes up, through the expectation you carry into a situation before it has even unfolded. Expectancy, in her teaching, was never a bonus mood reserved for naturally hopeful people. It was closer to a setting. And whatever setting you carry, chosen or not, is the one working on your behalf or against it. She returned often to the idea of divine order. That provision was already quietly in place, waiting to be recognized rather than earned through anxious effort. Fear rehearsed enough times can drown that order out almost entirely, not because divine order stops being true, but because a mind rehearsing lack has stopped expecting anything else to arrive, and expectancy, in her teaching, is most of what opens the door. None of this requires you to pretend a shortfall isn't real or to force cheerful words over a fear that hasn't been addressed. Florence never taught that. What she taught was closer to vigilance, noticing which words, which decrees, which flashes of expectancy you allow to repeat unchallenged, because unchallenged repetition, not any special force of its own, is where their power actually comes from. Faith and fear in her writing aren't opposites in the way people usually imagine, one loud and confident, the other timid and quiet. They're both decrees. Both get repeated, believed, and eventually acted upon by a mind that isn't choosing sides. It's simply following whichever one has been rehearsed the most. That single reframe changes everything about what comes next, because it means the mind you've been calling anxious, or realistic, or simply careful with money hasn't been broken this whole time. It has been faithfully doing exactly what it was asked to do. It was only ever asked the wrong question, A decree doesn't need to be shouted to take hold, it only needs to be repeated. It helps to see exactly where this shows up, because rehearsal rarely looks dramatic. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like rehearsing the answer before you've even asked the question, deciding a client will say no to your new rate or your boss will say no to a raise, and then never asking at all. The rejection already happened, in full, in a room only you were in. The real conversation was canceled before it could even begin. It looks like sitting across from a friend who mentions a bonus, a raise, an easier month, and feeling the quiet, automatic comparison arrive before you've decided to make one. The small voice tallying what you don't have, running its own version of the scene while you're still trying to smile and mean it. It looks like standing at the grocery checkout, doing quiet math before the total even appears, already deciding what you'll put back, already feeling the small defeat of that decision, seconds before you actually know whether you'll need to make it. The rehearsal runs ahead of the evidence every time. It looks like a conversation with your partner about money that starts in your head hours before it happens. You've already imagined the tone, the tension, the disappointed silence, and by the time you actually sit down to talk, you're not having a new conversation. You're performing one you've already run through a dozen times, bracing for a reaction that hasn't happened yet. It looks like opening your email to send an invoice and hesitating because some part of you has already pictured the client going quiet, the payment arriving late or not at all, the awkward follow-up message you'll eventually have to send. You haven't sent anything yet. You've already lived the worst version of the outcome. It looks like the sentence that leaves your mouth before you've thought about it. "I can't really afford that right now," said to a friend suggesting dinner, said to yourself standing in front of something you wanted. Said so often it no longer feels like a decision. It feels like a fact you're simply reporting. It looks like scrolling past an opportunity, a client, a job posting, a chance to raise your rates, and closing the tab before you've even read the details, because some quieter voice has already decided how it ends. You didn't reject the opportunity. You rehearsed its rejection of you, and then you acted accordingly. It looks like checking your balance the way some people check the weather before a trip they're dreading, not to plan, but to confirm what you already expect to find. And when the number matches what you rehearsed, it doesn't feel like data. It feels like proof. None of these moments feel like anything worth noticing on their own. That's exactly what makes them powerful. A rehearsal you can see coming is easy to interrupt. A rehearsal that feels like common sense, like realism, like simply knowing yourself, that one runs on its own all day without asking your permission even once. This is the version of you that most people never examine because it doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up dressed as caution, as practicality, as just being honest about where things stand. And so it keeps its seat at the table, performing the same scene in a dozen small moments while you go on believing you're simply describing your life instead of quietly directing it. Add these up across a single week and the number is staggering. Not the number in your account, but the number of times you performed a financial disappointment that hadn't actually happened yet. Dozens of small rehearsals, each one lasting only a few seconds, each one training the same reflex a little deeper. No single moment felt significant enough to interrupt. That's precisely how a pattern survives. Not through one dramatic scene, but through 100 forgettable ones, none of them alarming enough on their own to make you stop and ask what you were doing. By the end of most days, you haven't just lived your financial life, you've rehearsed it. Several times, in small moments no one else could see, repeating scenes your conscious mind never formally chose, and when the same scene is repeated often enough, it begins to feel less like a rehearsal and more like reality. Before going further, something needs to be said plainly, because without it, everything so far could be misheard. Your bills are real. The tight month is real. The client who paid late, the expense that caught you off guard, the number in your account that's lower than you'd like, none of that is imagination. Nothing in this teaching, or in Florence's, ever suggested that financial hardship is simply a trick of thought, something you conjured and could unconjure by feeling differently for an afternoon. That would be a cruel thing to say to anyone who has genuinely struggled, and it isn't true. So here is the distinction that matters, and it's smaller than it sounds. The circumstance is one thing. Rehearsing the circumstance is another. A difficult month is something that happens to you once, in real time, asking something real of you, attention, a decision, sometimes simply endurance. A rehearsed month is something you perform in your mind over and over, long after the moment that required a response has passed, or long before a moment that hasn't arrived yet even exists. You can test the difference fairly easily once you know to look for it. Planning ends. It reaches a decision or a next step, and then it releases you back to your day. Rehearsal doesn't end, it returns tomorrow uninvited, offering nothing new, the same scene replayed, with no decision waiting at the other side of it. If a thought about money keeps visiting without ever leading anywhere, that's usually your answer. It isn't preparing you for anything, it's simply repeating. Picture the difference side by side. You notice a bill is coming due next week, so you check what you have, move a little money if you need to, and go on with your evening. That's planning. It did its job in under a minute. Now picture the other version. You notice the same bill, and for the rest of the evening, in the background of everything else you're doing, some part of you keeps returning to it, replaying the moment you'll have to pay it, imagining the balance afterward, running the scene again while you're cooking dinner, again while you're trying to fall asleep. The bill required one decision. The rehearsal demanded a dozen performances of the same worry and changed nothing about the outcome. There's also a difference in what each one costs you. A hard month faced honestly asks you to respond to what is actually in front of you. You adjust, you make a call, you take the next step, and then you return to your life. A rehearsed month asks the same thing of you dozens of times a day for no return at all. You pay the emotional cost of the bad outcome again and again, whether or not the outcome ever arrives. In some cases, you pay it for years, for a version of events that never actually happened the way you rehearsed it. A circumstance can require your attention more than once. It can require several decisions, several conversations, even several months of adjustment, but each response is connected to something real and specific in front of you. Rehearsal is different. It keeps generating the same emotional response after there is nothing new to respond to. It's worth naming gently where this habit usually starts. Most people didn't invent their rehearsal out of nowhere. It began with something that was real, a genuinely hard season, a fear that once had good reason to exist. The rehearsal was never the problem at the beginning. It was simply memory, doing what memory does, trying to protect you from something that had already hurt you once. Memory learns quickly and forgets slowly. It doesn't check the calendar before it decides to stand guard again, and it rarely announces when the danger it's rehearsing has actually passed. So it keeps performing the old scene faithfully long after the season that produced it has ended, not out of malfunction, but out of loyalty to a version of you that genuinely needed the warning once. This is not a reason for shame, it's a reason for accuracy. The circumstance that started this may be long over. The rehearsal, quietly, may still be running on its own schedule, unrelated to whatever is actually true about your finances today. The bill is real. The rehearsal of everything you fear will happen because of that bill is something else entirely. So if the rehearsal is the real mechanism, not the circumstance itself, but the scene you keep performing around it, then the forgotten habit isn't complicated to name. It's simply this: stop rehearsing what you fear, begin rehearsing what you intend to experience. That's the whole habit, and it's worth sitting with how plain that sounds, because plain is not the same as easy, and it is certainly not the same as what you might be expecting. This isn't a call to think positive thoughts for a few minutes and hope something shifts. Positive thinking, as most people practice it, is usually a single hopeful sentence, said once, competing against a scene that's been rehearsed for years. That's not a fair fight, and it was never going to work, which is probably why you've tried it before and felt nothing change. What's being asked of you here is closer to what the actor does. Not a wish, said once, but a rehearsal, repeated on purpose, with the same seriousness you've unknowingly given to the version you feared. The bill you dreaded got vivid, specific detail, the exact number, the exact tone of voice, the exact sinking feeling. The forgotten habit asks you to give that same vivid, specific detail to the outcome you are willing to expect. Not a vague wish for more money, but a scene held in the mind, rehearsed until it starts to feel as familiar as the one it's replacing. This is precisely why vague affirmations tend to fail, and why you may have tried something like this before without much result. "I am wealthy," repeated once, flatly in the mirror, is asking your mind to accept a scene with no detail, no feeling, and no repetition behind it. A single sentence has very little weight when it is competing with a pattern you've repeated for years. This was never a failure of belief. It was simply an uneven rehearsal. This is where Florence's teaching becomes practical rather than theoretical. She never taught abstract optimism. She taught expectancy, a deliberate, repeated act of imagining and declaring the outcome you intend, held with the same conviction you'd give to a fact you already knew was true. Not because saying it once makes it real, but because a scene rehearsed with feeling again and again becomes the pattern the mind reaches for automatically, the same mechanism that built the fear, now working in the other direction. You may already be asking the fair question, what if I rehearse something and it doesn't happen exactly as I pictured it? That question matters, and it deserves a direct answer, not a dismissal. This habit was never presented as a guarantee that circumstances rearrange themselves the instant you imagine them differently. What changes first, reliably, is you. The tone you carry into a hard conversation, the composure you bring to a tight month, the decisions you're able to make when you're not spending half your day auditioning disaster. Florence taught that provision moves through an ordered universe quietly, on its own timing. Your part was never to force the outcome, it was to stop rehearsing against it. You are not being asked to lie to yourself about where things stand today. The bill from the last block is still real. What changes is what you do with the space around it. The hours, the small unguarded moments, the checkout lines and quiet evenings that used to belong by default to the old scene. Those moments are not neutral. They were never neutral. They were simply rehearsal time spent on a performance you didn't choose. The forgotten habit is choosing deliberately what gets rehearsed in that same space instead. Think of it this way. Every day already contains a certain amount of unclaimed rehearsal time. The minutes in the shower, the drive to pick up groceries, the stretch before sleep when your mind wanders on its own. For years, that time has quietly belonged to the old scene, filled without your permission by whatever fear happened to be loudest that day. None of that time was ever truly empty. It was simply undirected. The habit isn't inventing new hours in your day. It's reclaiming ones you were already spending and asking them to perform something on your behalf instead of against you. We'll walk through exactly how to do this slowly and specifically a little later in this video. Not as a quick trick, but as a real rehearsal, the kind that actually changes what your mind performs without being asked to. For now, simply let this settle. The same mechanism that has been working against you, quietly, for years, is available to work the other way. It was never broken. It was only ever pointed at the wrong scene. You don't need a new mind. You need a new script, and the habit of rehearsing it until it becomes the one your mind performs first. The habit has a name now. What it doesn't have yet, until you give it one, is a beginning. So start here, in the smallest possible way, with a single sentence, written where you'll actually see it again. If you're ready to close the old rehearsal and open a new one, write this in the comments below. From now on, I will rehearse my success. Not as a promise you're making to anyone else. As the first line of the new scene, the one you'll return to deliberately, instead of the one that used to arrive on its own. Let it sit there in writing as something you can come back to later in this video when it's time to actually begin rehearsing it. So return to the same ordinary Tuesday from earlier, because the new habit doesn't need a special occasion. It needs the same small moments the old rehearsal used to own. At the grocery checkout, instead of the quiet math that already assumes defeat, you let yourself picture something specific. The moment, not far off, when you fill the cart without doing that math at all, when the total appears and it simply gets paid, without ceremony, without a flinch. not a vague abundance, that exact scene held for a few seconds on purpose. Before the conversation with your partner about money, instead of rehearsing the tension in advance, you picture the version where the conversation is calm, where you both sit down, say the numbers plainly, and land on a decision together, no raised voices, no dread carried in from 3 imagined arguments that never happened. You give that scene the same detail you used to give the fight. Before you send the invoice, instead of picturing the client going quiet, you picture the reply arriving, the payment landing on time, your own hand closing the laptop without a second thought about it. It doesn't need to feel guaranteed. It only needs to be specific enough to compete with the old scene and repeated enough to start to feel familiar, where you once felt the automatic comparison arrive while a friend described their bonus or their easier month. You let yourself picture, just as specifically, your own version arriving in its own time. Not resentment dressed up as hope, but a genuine quiet expectancy that your own good month is still on its way, simply on a different schedule. Where you once heard yourself say, "I can't really afford that," you begin deliberately reaching for a different sentence when it is true and appropriate. "I'm making room for that," or "I'm working toward that." The words matter because Florence placed such importance on what we repeatedly declare. You are teaching yourself to speak from possibility rather than automatically from limitation. Where you once closed the tab on an opportunity before reading it, you let yourself finish reading it and picture specifically the version where you apply or ask or send the message, not because the outcome is certain, but because you're no longer rehearsing its rejection before it's had a chance to be anything else. And when you check your balance, you do it simply as information. You look at the number that's actually there instead of rehearsing the number you fear will be there. You make the decision the facts require, then you return to your life. This is where Florence's teaching becomes especially practical. Expectation changes what you bring to the moment. A person expecting rejection behaves differently from a person expecting an opportunity. A person expecting shortage notices different possibilities from a person who has begun expecting increase. And that difference can affect what you say, what you attempt, what you notice, what you accept, and what you are willing to ask for. None of this needs to happen all at once, and none of it needs to feel convincing on the first attempt. An actor doesn't believe the scene the first night either. The lines feel foreign, the movements feel deliberate rather than natural, and the performance only starts to feel natural after repetition. There's no reason to expect this to work differently. You are not required to feel completely different today. You are required to practice differently today. That distinction matters because the old rehearsal became automatic precisely because you repeated it without demanding that it feel natural first. You worried before you had evidence. You imagined the rejection before you asked. You felt the loss before you knew the outcome. Now you reverse the order. You give yourself permission to see another possibility before reality has finished unfolding. Each of these moments is small enough to seem unimportant on its own. That was always true of the old rehearsal, too. It never needed a single dramatic scene. It only needed thousands of small ones, repeated without objection, scattered across ordinary moments nobody else would have noticed. The new one asks for exactly the same thing, pointed in a different direction. It doesn't need a quiet room, a candle, or a special hour of the day. It fits into the checkout line, the drive home, the 2 minutes before a call you've been dreading, the same cracks in the day the old scene used to slip into uninvited, and slowly something begins to change. You stop waiting for fear to tell you what the next scene will be. You begin deciding what deserves your attention before fear gets there first. The habit was never about one grand rehearsal. It's about which scene gets the next 10 seconds of your attention, today and then again tomorrow, and then again the day after that, until the new one is simply the one that shows up first. This next part isn't something to just listen to, it's something to actually do. Right now, in this moment, while the idea is still fresh enough to act on. So if you can, let your shoulders drop a little. You don't need to close your eyes unless that helps you focus. You just need a few quiet minutes and a willingness to rehearse something on purpose for the first time. Take one slow breath before we begin. The old rehearsal took years to build. This one only asks for a few honest minutes, done slowly. Start by naming the old scene, just once without dwelling in it. What is the version you've been rehearsing without meaning to? Maybe it's a specific number that scares you. Maybe it's a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's simply a feeling, that quiet, familiar tightness whenever money comes up. Whatever it is, name it to yourself, briefly, the way you'd name a scene before closing the script on it. You don't need to relive it. You only need to recognize it clearly enough to know exactly what you're setting down. Now choose one area of your financial life. Just one, not all of it at once. Not everything gets better. One specific thing, the invoice sitting unpaid, the conversation you've been rehearsing badly, the number you're hoping to see in your account by a certain point this year. Pick the one that matters most right now. Picture the first detail of the new scene. Not as a vague good feeling, but as something specific, the way an actor would build one. What do you see first? Is it a screen, a letter, a face across the table? What's the exact number if there's a number involved? Now notice your own body inside this scene. What does your posture look like here? Are you sitting up a little straighter than usual? Breathing a little easier than usual? What do you hear? Is there a particular sentence someone says to you, or one you say out loud yourself? Let the scene have edges. Vague scenes are easy to forget. Specific ones are the ones that get rehearsed. Once you can see it clearly, give it a short sentence. One that expresses the outcome you're willing to expect. Something you can return to without forcing yourself to believe more than you actually do. It might sound like, I am ready to receive this. Or, I expect good things to come from this. Or, depending on the scene, the right way is opening for this. There's no single correct sentence. Choose whichever one you could say without flinching and let it belong to this particular scene, not to every part of your life at once. Hold the full scene for a few more seconds, the detail, your body, the sentence together. Let it be the thing your mind is doing on purpose in a moment that used to belong to something else entirely. If doubt shows up here, and it likely will, that's not a sign you're doing this wrong. It's simply the old rehearsal, noticing its usual time slot has been given to something else. Let it sit in the room if it wants to. You can hold a new scene and a flicker of doubt at the same time. It's also normal if this feels forced the first time through. Nobody sounds natural in a role they've only just been handed. Now, gently picture one small difficulty showing up inside this same scene. A delay, a question you didn't expect, a moment that doesn't go perfectly. Instead of collapsing back into the old rehearsal, picture yourself staying with the sentence you chose anyway. This isn't about pretending difficulties won't come. It's about discovering that your expectancy doesn't have to disappear the moment something real interrupts it. That steadiness, more than the scene itself, is the actual habit. Before you move on, choose one small, real moment in your ordinary day where you'll bring this scene back. The same notification that used to make you brace, the same drive home, the same few minutes before sleep. Give the new rehearsal the exact seat the old one used to occupy. It doesn't need a new appointment. It only needs the one the fear was already using. This is the habit in its smallest working form, a few seconds given deliberately to a specific scene, in the exact places the old rehearsal used to arrive uninvited. Same time slots, different scene. Do this once today and you may barely notice a difference, but repeat it in the same ordinary moments, tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and familiarity begins to change sides. And the next time the old worry returns, come back to this exercise. You don't have to fight the thought or wonder why it came back. Let this video become a place where you practice the new scene again. The goal is not to never feel financial fear. The goal is to know what to rehearse when it appears. You already know how to rehearse. You've been doing it for years, expertly, without ever meaning to. The only thing that changes now is which scene gets the practice. Here is something worth knowing before you close this video and go back to your day. The real test of this habit was never going to happen while you were sitting still, breathing slowly, picturing a scene on purpose. That part is practice. The test comes later, unannounced, in the exact moment the old trigger shows up again. Because it will. The bill will still arrive. Someone will still glance at your cart or your car or your calendar and say, without thinking, "That's expensive." A month will still come in slower than you hoped, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything you've rehearsed. None of that stops simply because you've learned a new habit. And if you expected it to, this next part matters more than anything that came before it. The old scene will still try to start. That's not failure, and it's not evidence that the habit didn't work. It's simply the old pattern doing what patterns do, showing up where it's always shown up, at the first familiar cue, exactly on schedule. What changes now isn't whether the trigger arrives. What changes is what happens in the few seconds right after it does. Picture it concretely. The bill lands in your inbox, and for a half second, the old rehearsal begins the way it always has, the tightening, the reach for the worst version of the number before you've even opened it. In the old pattern, that half second used to run for the rest of the evening, uninterrupted, performing the same disaster a dozen times before bed. In the new pattern, that half second is still allowed to happen. It's simply not allowed to run the whole show anymore. You notice it starting, the way you'd notice a familiar song beginning to play, and you have a response you can begin practicing. Notice it, interrupt it, and reach for the scene you've been practicing instead. This is exactly why the exercise from a few minutes ago wasn't a one-time event. It was rehearsal, in the truest sense, building a scene familiar enough that you can reach for it quickly under pressure without needing perfect calm first. An actor doesn't wait for ideal conditions to perform the part they've practiced. They perform it because they've practiced it, even on a night they don't feel like it, even in front of a difficult audience. The rehearsal is what makes the performance possible precisely when conditions aren't ideal. So the next time someone says that's expensive and you feel the old flinch arrive, you don't need to force a smile or pretend the comment didn't land. You simply notice the flinch, let it be there, and return deliberately, the way you practiced, to the sentence and the scene you chose. Not because the comment doesn't matter, because you've decided which scene gets your attention afterward. Or picture a conversation with a family member who mentions, casually, that money's been tight for everyone lately, and you feel that old comparison start to rise, the tally, the quiet dread that you're behind. In the old pattern, you'd have spent the rest of the visit rehearsing it silently, replaying the comment on the drive home. In the new pattern, you let the comment land, you feel whatever it actually stirs, and then you come back to the scene you've been practicing, not to erase the conversation, but to decide it doesn't get to write the rest of your evening for you. The next time a slow month arrives, you're allowed to feel the real disappointment of a slow month. That was never the part we were trying to remove. What you're no longer required to do is spend the following 3 weeks rehearsing every version of how much worse it might get. You can respond to the month you're actually having, make the decisions it requires, and let the new scene, not the old one, fill the space that used to belong to dread. This is what it actually looks like to change a habit rooted this deep. Not a single dramatic morning where the fear disappears for good. 100 small moments where the old scene starts, and you, a little more each time, choose not to finish it. The forgotten habit was never about avoiding hard moments. It's about deciding, in the middle of one, which scene you're willing to keep rehearsing. Something else starts to happen once you've practiced this for a while. Quieter than the moment-to-moment interruptions from the last block, but further reaching. It shows up less in how you handle a single hard trigger and more in the shape of your ordinary decisions. You'll notice it first in your language, and you won't have to try very hard to notice it, because it starts happening without effort, the same way the old language used to. Where you once said, "I could never do that," you'll catch yourself saying, "I'm looking into it," before you've even decided to. Where you once avoided a numbering conversation, you'll say it plainly because it no longer feels like admitting a weakness. This isn't a performance you're putting on for other people. It's simply what a rehearsed sentence sounds like once it's been practiced enough to arrive on its own. You'll notice it next in what you're willing to ask for, the rate you've been afraid to raise for 2 years. The raise you kept deciding not to bring up because you'd already rehearsed the no. The opportunity you used to scroll past. None of these require a different set of facts than you had before. The client can still say no, the answer can still be disappointing. What's different is that you're no longer rehearsing the rejection so many times beforehand that asking starts to feel pointless. You simply ask because you're no longer performing the refusal for yourself in advance. Picture the difference concretely. The old rehearsal used to draft the email in your head a dozen times before you sent nothing at all, each version ending the same discouraging way until the whole idea quietly died somewhere between your first thought and your actual inbox. The new rehearsal doesn't guarantee the outcome you want. It simply gets you to the point of actually sending the email, asking the question you'd already answered no on your own behalf for years. That's the entire difference, and it turns out to be a significant one because an unsent request has a success rate of exactly 0, no matter how it might have gone. There's a particular kind of noticing that starts to open up here as well. Florence taught that expectation changes what a person is able to see, not only how they feel. A person bracing for rejection tends to notice the reasons an opportunity won't work. A person who has been rehearsing possibility tends to notice what might actually work within the same opportunity. The opportunity itself hasn't changed. What's changed is which details you're paying attention to inside it, and attention over time tends to shape what you actually pursue. It's worth being honest here about what this is and isn't. This isn't a claim that circumstances rearrange themselves simply because your rehearsal changed. The client still has to say yes, the employer still has to approve the raise, the market still does what markets do. What changes reliably is the version of you that walks into those conversations, steadier, less braced, less likely to talk yourself out of trying before you've even started. That alone tends to change outcomes over time, not through anything mysterious, but because a person who asks, negotiates, and pursues opportunities consistently ends up with different results than a person who has spent years rehearsing why none of it would work. Other people tend to notice this shift too, even if they couldn't say exactly what changed. Not because you're performing confidence for their benefit, but because a person who isn't silently auditioning disaster in every financial conversation carries a different kind of presence, steadier, easier to trust, less likely to negotiate against themselves before anyone else has said a word. None of this arrives all at once, and it was never meant to. It arrives the way any rehearsed thing arrives, gradually, through the accumulation of small moments where you chose the new scene instead of defaulting to the old one. Somewhere along the way, without a single dramatic turning point you could point back to, rehearsing possibility simply becomes the thing your mind does first. You don't decide, once, to become someone who expects good things. You become that person the same way you became someone who expected the worst, by rehearsing it, quietly, until it was simply who you were. There's one more thing worth saying plainly, now that you've heard the whole of it. You were never going to control every circumstance in your financial life. No habit does that, and nothing in this video ever claimed otherwise. The bill will still come. Some things will simply be hard on their own timeline, whether you've rehearsed anything or not. What you can influence quietly, deliberately, every single day is what you rehearse while you're moving through it. That was the whole habit, from the very first scene at the beginning of this video to the one you practiced with your own hands and your own imagination a little while ago. Not the circumstances. The scene you keep performing around them. This is where Florence's teaching finishes making sense, if it hadn't already. She never promised a life without hard seasons. What she pointed to again and again was expectancy. The quiet decision about what you carry into a hard season, repeated so often it becomes the thing your mind reaches for first. A word held with feeling, spoken as a decree rather than a complaint. Not because saying it once changes anything, because rehearsing it, the way you've been practicing, eventually does. If you're ready to close the old rehearsal and keep practicing the new one, write this in the comments below. I choose the scene I rehearse from here. Not as a promise you're making to anyone watching, as a line you can return to, the same way you'll return to the exercise from earlier, the next time an old trigger shows up and tries to run its old scene. And if this found you at the right moment, consider staying. There's a whole channel here built on exactly this kind of quiet, patient work, one video at a time, for exactly the season you're in right now. Somewhere tomorrow, an ordinary trigger will arrive. A notification, a number, a comment from someone who doesn't know what they've just stirred in you. You won't be able to stop every trigger from showing up, but you know now what to rehearse when it does.